The last time I was on the ferry, the buildings were there, and so my heart just aches. That's the only way I can describe it. It just aches.
It's like a nightmare. It really is. There's nothing there no more. There's nothing. It's all gone.
One thing that the officials of the Staten Island Ferry point out is that the ferry did continue to operate last week. Didn't take passengers. It did take emergency personnel and equipment. Now they say they're back to normal, a 24/7 schedule. One thing has changed, though. Prior to the disaster, they used to take vehicles on board the Staten Island Ferry. They say they won't be taking vehicles now for the foreseeable future. One more change in what has been a lot of changes here in New York and across the nation. Bill?
They cannot stop staring, and neither can we. Marty Savage, south end of Manhattan. Thank you, Marty. I want to take you down to the area that's known as the Zone, or some people calling it the Pile, others Ground Zero. CNN's Gary Tuchman about 2 blocks away from the World Trade Center, where some of the more brutal work is being done here in New York City. Gary, hello to you.
Bill, hello to you. The search continues for survivors, but all they are finding is the dead. The smoke continues to rise behind me. Excuse me, the air still has a stench. It's one of the reasons we cough occasionally. They're still looking for missing people, the number 4,957. A short time ago, I was on top of a 40-story building here, just a block away from where I'm standing right now. I looked to the north, and I saw the gleaming structure of the Empire State Building under the peaceful blue sky. I looked to the south and reflexively expected to see the World Trade Center. Instead, just saw this smoky cauldron, which we've now seen for 6 days, which is still, frankly, very hard to believe. Regarding the search for victims, the search for possible survivors, there are 6 levels underneath the World Trade Center building. It's about 120 feet from the ground level to the bottom. According to police officials we've talked with, they have searched much of it. They have not found one survivor, but there are certain parts underneath the rubble they cannot get to because it is simply too dangerous. If there was a reasonable expectation that searchers would not get hurt, they would do it. However, they feel there's a reasonable expectation that searchers would get hurt or possibly get killed, so they can't get to those areas. They tried to get to them from underground, but the subway tunnels where they were going in through were flooded. That's the scenario. One of the searchers is a gentleman by the name of Sergeant Antonio Scannello. Sergeant Scannello is on a Port Authority police squadron of 9 people. 6 of his people are missing. There are 3 of them left. He is still continuing in the search, and we talked to him about it.
My whole working squad was working that day, and many of my good friends are in there.
How do you cope?
I don't know. I just try to be strong.
It certainly isn't easy to keep strong. This is what many of these people here are going through. Many people, perhaps most of the searchers inside, know someone who is missing. They've also been told by their bosses here, most of the people participating in the search, that they must take a day off as soon as possible. They're not being told they should take a day off. They're being told they must, not only for their well-being, but they think it'll also help the search. There are a lot more people here than they need. There are people to replace them, and they want people to be as fresh as they can possibly be. Bill, back to you.
Gary, quickly here, the mayor today mentioned something. He's mentioned it a few days ago, too, but he mentioned the possibility that some bodies will never be located and never found inside that rubble behind you. Are many people down there that you have conversations with prepared for that possibility?
I think that's what officials are trying to do, is prepare people for that possibility. Because of the fact that nearly 5,000 people are missing, it's not only very likely, it's completely probable that many of the victims will never be found. That's very bad news. But we must emphasize that they really do still believe it's possible for survivors to be there. They are hoping for a lucky break where they could find a survivor. One thing I want to mention to you, one story we heard from a police officer. They got deep underground. They saw a car under there. They saw a body inside the car, and it was someone who had passed away. They were hoping it would have been a survivor.
Another story. Gary Tuchman from what is known as Ground Zero with us today, and I can attest, Gary, that the choking sensation you get there after being on Wall Street throughout the day today, that smoke drifts in, and sometimes it can be pungent, gets in your eyes, and once it gets in your lungs, too, you can end up choking quite a bit for quite a long time. And indeed, the masks that people have been using throughout this entire operation are needed in many, many cases. Back to Atlanta. More coming up shortly here in New York. Here's Joey, though. Joey.
Bill, ahead here, the diplomatic efforts to build support for attacks against terrorists what Pakistan has done to try to assist the United States. And later, a Russian expert on fighting a war inside Afghanistan talks about the dangers, potential dangers to U.S. troops.
They're coming through town, Williams volunteers from all over the country, riding along pipeline routes, raising money for the United Way. Last year, $16 million. This year, even more. Please support your local United Way with a contribution that stays in your community. We don't think of it as charity. We think of it as our investment in a better world.
He wants a remote photonic network with ultra-high bandwidth for the new plant, where I'll be relocated. The network? Great. Me move there? No way.
You can accomplish anything, even optical networking. Fujitsu, the possibilities are infinite.
Want a job that makes you happy? Post your resume now. Monster.com.
You the monster.
Osama bin Laden is a prime suspect, and the people who house him, encourage him, provide food, comfort, or money are on notice.
Today, Washington's message was formally put to the Taliban by a delegation from Pakistan. CNN's Mike Chinoy is in the Pakistani capital, Islamabad.
Amid heightened security and growing tension at home, Pakistan's government waited for news of its last-ditch effort to avoid war. In the southern Afghan city of Kandahar, a team from Pakistan's military intelligence service delivered a blunt message to the Taliban: hand over Osama bin Laden and his associates or face the consequences.
We hope that the government of Afghanistan will act with responsibility in the terribly grave situation raised by these horrendous terrorist attacks.
If anyone can influence the Taliban, it's the ISI, Pakistani military intelligence, which played a key role during Afghanistan's civil war in helping the Taliban seize and hold power. Now, though, as President Pervez Musharraf moves to ally his government with Washington, officials here are unclear whether the Taliban will listen to them.
The assumption that Pakistan is in a position to exercise complete influence is flawed in our opinion. We have constantly pointed out to our friends that we have diplomatic relations, but that doesn't necessarily translate into great influence.
Meanwhile, the government has already responded to one U.S. request, closing its borders with Afghanistan, keeping growing numbers of refugees at bay, and halting shipments of everything but food. The government's stance has stirred sharp opposition in some quarters here, especially from Islamic fundamentalists, many of whom have close links with the Taliban. Demonstrations against President Musharraf have broken out in several cities. There are fears things could get worse.
It could be pretty destabilizing. It will begin in the northern areas, between the border areas of Balochistan and the frontier. And if the conflict is long drawn out, it will spill over into the streets of Lahore and Karachi and the urban areas. And at that time, General Musharraf and this government will be hard-pressed.
The government knows this and has reportedly asked the U.S. for large-scale economic aid and political support in return. But that may not be enough to prevent turmoil in the streets or possible reprisal attacks by Taliban or bin Laden supporters as Pakistan chooses sides in this new war against terrorism. Mike Chinoy, CNN, Islamabad, Pakistan.
On the other hand, the United States will not get military support from another country which neighbors Afghanistan. Iran's foreign minister told CNN today the United States should not punish a country while trying to punish terrorists. And in Washington today, Secretary of State Colin Powell said it will not be enough to get at Osama bin Laden.
Osama bin Laden is the chairman of a holding company, and within that holding company are terrorist cells and organizations in dozens of countries around the world, any one of them capable of committing a terrorist act. So it is not enough to get one individual, although we'll start with that one individual. It will not be over until we have gotten into the inside of this organization, inside its decision cycle, inside its planning cycle, inside its execution capability, and until we have neutralized and destroyed it.
Joining us now with the latest from the State Department is CNN's Andrea Koppel. Andrea, follow up on this a little bit. How clear is Pakistan's support for the United States? How clear is it that Pakistan is on board?
Well, Joey, publicly and privately, it's very clear. U.S. officials tell us that President Pervez Musharraf has said explicitly that he has agreed to everything on a list of specific demands that the U.S. put forward last week. And they're taking him at his word. But really, we'll have to see whether or not they follow through on those specific requests when a U.S. delegation travels to Pakistan in coming days to give them more details.
We have talked about other elements to all of this. Talk to us about the next diplomatic steps. What other nations need to be on board? What else is the State Department working toward here?
Well, there are a number of pieces to this diplomatic puzzle. One of the biggest pieces is within the Arab world in countries like Morocco, Egypt, Saudi Arabia. Why are they important? Well, you heard Secretary Powell talk about those holding companies, those terrorist cells. Many of them operate on the soil of these countries in the Arab world. The U.S. needs them to shut them down, to cut off all financial support that go from those cells to the Taliban, to bin Laden's network in Afghanistan. There's a second portion to that. Many of those countries are Islamic. The U.S. needs it to be made very clear that this is not the U.S. against bin Laden because he's Islamic. This is a law enforcement issue. This is an act of terrorism. Countries like Saudi Arabia, which are known as the Mecca for many of the holiest sites in the Islamic world, need to come out publicly and say that this is not East against West. This is the international community against acts of terrorism. It's a message that should be reinforced later this week when the Saudi foreign minister comes here to Washington. Another big area is Central Asia. They border northern Afghanistan. They need to shut down their borders. They also have terrorist cells operating in there. And finally, Joey, there is Russia, which of course its own history as the Soviet Union had a lot of experience in Afghanistan and now today with terrorism. So those are three big diplomatic pieces to that puzzle, Joey.
CNN's Andrea Koppel at the State Department for us. When we talk about Afghanistan, we're talking about a country that is largely unfamiliar to most of us. To try to add to our knowledge, we've invited on board with us Frank Anderson, former chief of the CIA's Afghan Task Force. We understand that that was your role in the 1990s when bin Laden's influence was growing within Afghanistan. I'm wondering if you can tell us, give us some insight. We've heard a great deal about his strengths there. What are his weaknesses?
Well, first, let me a minor correction. I did the Afghan Task Force in the 1980s, 1987 to 89.
Forgive me for that. But what can you tell us about any weaknesses that he has?
Well, let's talk about his weaknesses in the sense that Afghanistan is truly a country that no one has been able to conquer, no one has been able to rule throughout its history. The Taliban are Osama bin Laden's only protectors, or his hosts, to the extent that he has protectors in Afghanistan. And while they do control some 95% of the territory of Afghanistan, they're a long way from having real secure control over the country, and they're a long way from being truly united. So we're confronted with a situation where we have to deal with the Afghans' unwillingness to some extent and their inability to some extent to work with us, but neither of those things is absolute.
But I think you're going away from where I started with you, which I think is, all right, you have outlined to us some of the fragile nature of the host country, or what we believe to be the host country for Osama bin Laden, but for him himself. Does he have particular frailty?